Okay.
Do you want to mute
Yes.
me, Kathy, during this part?
Can you mute yourself? I'm kind of
If
in
I
a...
mute myself, I can't unmute myself.
Ah, okay. Hang on. Let me see. There we go. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Sorry, that just kind of threw me. I'll be with you in just a second. There's an awful lot for me to do this morning, more than usual, but we'll get there. Okay, so this morning I am speaking on the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Noble Eightfold Path is a profound teaching from Buddhism. And it's really 8 elements of practice that work together, kind of like 8 limbs work together in one body. And it really helps us live the most enlightened life. It's a path that helps us free ourselves from suffering. And the Buddha offered this teaching on the Noble Eightfold Path in his very first Dharma talk. And he continued to teach this Noble Eightfold Path for 45 years, for his whole ministry. And in our Unity tradition, we study teachings from a variety of spiritual paths. And that's what I love about Unity. And this teaching is helpful in 3 ways in particular. It's training, and it's training in living ethically. It's training in higher consciousness and how to get to higher consciousness through the ability of concentration and then meditation and then samadhi. And it's training in higher wisdom. And that is what I want to focus on today, is the particular pieces of this path that are training in higher wisdom. But let me just share the eightfold path with you. It's comprised of right view, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the Dalai Lama offers teachings often on the Noble Eightfold Path. And he explains that right livelihood, right action, and right speech are really ethical training. That's learning to live ethically, and it's concerning morality. And then right mindfulness, right effort, and right concentration concern higher consciousness. And then right view, how we perceive, and right thinking, which is also sometimes called right intention, concern wisdom. And so that's what I want to start with today, is those 2 things. Having right view and having right thinking. But before I start and get into that, I want you to just take a moment and consider, what is it to be a noble person? You know, it's called the Noble Eightfold Path. What is it to walk a noble path? Um, when I think of a noble person, I think of someone who is wise. I think of someone who is content, who has contentment, who just embodies contentment. I think of someone who is honest and fair, and someone at peace, someone who carries peace. They are peace in the way they live. And I also think of someone who is just deeply good, deeply good. I think of someone like the Dalai Lama, you know, and he says we should practice this Eightfold Path with honesty and contentment. With honesty and contentment. So let's begin, and let's look at right view. Right view is about perceiving things as they are, as they really are, and not as they seem to be through all the filters in us. It's amazing how we can all look at the same thing, but have such differing views of what we're seeing, right? There is a poem that was written in the 19th century by John Godfrey Sachs called The Blind Men and the Elephant. And it was about these 6 men who were blind. They were taken to meet an elephant, right? And they were blind. And they went to the elephant. And they were each touching a different part of the elephant. And each was having a completely different perspective of what an elephant was. One man was holding on to the tail, and he said, an elephant is like a rope. And another one was holding the ear, and he said, an elephant is like a fan, right? The next one, he put his arms around the elephant's leg, and he said, an elephant is like a big tree trunk. Another one was running his hand along the broad, leathery side of the animal, and his view was that an elephant's like a big, broad, bending piece of leather. So each one of them had a limited view, what we would call a point of view, right? Each one had a point of view, but not the whole view. And so their knowledge of the elephant was incomplete. It was inaccurate. And so I love this poem because it shows us how we too, our views sometimes are just a point of view, and they're incomplete often, and they're inaccurate sometimes. What we think we know about people, what we think we know about life, and what we know about issues, it's all colored by the filters of our conditioning. And our conditioning being, of course, what's happened to us in life, what's happened to us in our lives. Sometimes how we see is colored by our fear. I was hiking with Kyra. I told you that she came up here and we did social distance camping. And we were on a hike at the lake week before last, and she was way up ahead of me, and I heard her shriek, and she ran back and ran behind me, and she was very scared because she had seen a snake, and it was a garter snake. And so I love snakes, so I was delighted to see it. And why do I love snakes? Well, because when I was a kid, we had a couple of pet black snakes. These like 5 foot long, very docile, very sweet, harmless black snakes. And I held them all the time. And so I learned to love snakes, and I learned to be very comfortable with them. So I was conditioned to like snakes, and Kyra has been conditioned to fear them. So we're beholding the same thing, but we have very different views of that thing, okay? So our fear affects our view. The other filter that affects our view is our desires. A lot of times, when we see things through what we desire, we don't see them as they are. We see them more as what they can do for us, and that's not seeing them clearly. Probably the biggest desire of our ego self is the desire to be right. And say we're aligned with a particular political party, and we desire to be right about that choice. So say when that party or that party leader does something unethical, we want to justify it, because what we're really justifying is that we're right, and that we, in this case, that we're right about our political choice or alignment. So our desires and our desire to be right affects how we see and how we don't see, okay? So how we perceive, how we see is also often due to our attachments and our aversions. What we're attached to and what we're aversive to, what we want to push away, has a huge effect on how we see. Here's another example. I was at the lake. I spent a lot of time at the lake. And I was sitting peacefully one afternoon at my favorite little spot and listening to the birds sing and getting ready to swim. And I saw on the other side of this lake a patio boat. And it was the only one on the lake. And it started up its engine and it just came straight towards me. It made a beeline right towards me and parked right out in front of me about 25 yards out in the lake. And the people were these rambunctious, loud partying people, and they had loud rock music playing. And I had been feeling so much peace, and I just found myself feeling so much resistance and judging these people, these out-of-towners who can't just enjoy the sound of nature, but have to bring this noise pollution. And I found myself breathing in that diesel smell of that boat engine and just feeling really irritated and resentful. And so I reflected at how I shifted from that peace I was in to such irritation. And all of a sudden, I was suffering. I had gone from peace to suffering. And I saw that how I lost my peace was because I had attachments. I had attachments to being alone and to having it quiet at the lake, right? So as I widened my view to see more clearly what is, not what is through what I'm attached to, I realized it's not my private lake, you know? Other people want to be happy too, and their idea of having fun is different than mine. It's louder than mine. And so if I don't resist, if I let go of fighting what is, and maybe imagine that those people are my family, right? And they're out there having a good time. I can let go of the irritation and the resentment that's making me suffer. They call this renunciation, having an intention of renunciation, letting go, like we've been singing about and talking about today. So I did that. I changed my view. I let go of fighting what is. I let go of those folks and seeing them as noisy tourist invaders, and I instead saw them as family. And I got back to peace. I got back to not suffering. So that developing the wisdom of right view is to be able to, number one, notice we're suffering when we are. Number two, examine why. Be able to really self-reflect and examine why are we suffering. And number three, see if it's our perception. Notice our filters. It's very important. It's just how we learn about ourselves. Okay? Notice when you're attached. Notice when you're averse, or notice when you're in fear, or notice when you're wanting to be right at all cost. There's a lot of this going on in this country, and if people could self-reflect, we could begin to communicate again. We could begin to listen to each other and gain understanding of each other. And that really is the beginning of the healing of division. So if we can notice these things and change our view, we can free ourselves from a lot of suffering. I think we can think of our view as our theory of life. We all have a theory of life, and it's important to examine our theory of life because that's how we make decisions. That's how we make judgments. It's based on our theory of life. A lot of times our views are unexamined. They're unexamined opinions and assumptions that we inherited from our upbringing, from our culture. And in our culture, we're having a big moment right now where we are re-examining what we accepted before about our history, about our historical past, the United States, about the past of our country and its founders and the people that we've memorialized through monuments. And I think it's good. I think it's good to examine our past. That's a tenet in AA that I think is so valuable. You examine your personal past and you take responsibility and you take an inventory of your personal history. And I think it's important we do it collectively too, as a country, as a nation. Sometimes we need to review. I love that. Isn't that a great word? Review. We're talking about right view. Sometimes we need to review. And I looked up the definition of review. It is a formal examination of something with a possibility or intention of making a change if necessary. Okay, so sometimes our view needs a change. Sometimes it needs to be modified, even rejected and transformed. This moment in time in our history is asking us to re-examine our views on race, that people inherited from their family or from their culture. I remember taking my dad, I think I might have told this story once before, but this is telling the story from a different point of view. But I remember taking my dad to meet Alma for the first time, Alma the Hugging Saint. And she was touring in Washington, D.C. I think it was about 20 years ago. And my dad had a bit of a racist attitude passed down to him. And so for him, being with Alma, right, being Indian and being dark-skinned, it was a stretch for him to go to her program, take off his shoes and leave them at the door, and then go up to this Indian woman saint and get on his knees so he could get in her lap and receive one of her hugs. And my brother and I were also there, and we all went together for a hug and a blessing from Alma. And when we were in front of her, she started rubbing my dad's heart really vigorously. And my dad had recently had some heart issues, which, nobody told her. But Dad started crying, and then so did my brother, and then so did I. And Alma seemed to be releasing blockages in his heart. And it was so touching. And afterwards, Dad seemed so tender and reflective. And we went to lunch. And at lunch, he said something that I'll never forget that really surprised me, that like I was witnessing his transformation. He said that he'd been unwilling to say hello and welcome his new neighbor, a black man who had recently moved in. And he decided when he got home, he was going to go up and approach his neighbor. He was going to say hello and greet him and shake his hand and welcome him to the neighborhood. And so it was as if Alma helped my dad see his erroneous view, his racism, that had been passed down to him. And she helped him change that view and see more clearly and see more with eyes of seeing our shared humanity instead of different skin color. So often we inherit views, and often we've never examined them. We've never questioned them. And yet this is essential for us to evolve if we truly want unity like we say we do. So if we can get over our need to be right about past views and be willing to reconsider them, we can develop a mind that sees what is beyond what is conditioned in us, okay? I saw a great Facebook meme yesterday. A friend posted that said, important phrases we should all learn to say as we learn and grow. And then it listed these phrases, which are great phrases. The first one is, in light of that new information in light of that new information, I have changed my mind. Or another one, oh, I didn't know that before, I guess I was wrong. Imagine saying that. Or from the evidence provided, it appears I need to rethink things. Or you make a strong argument, I'll consider what you said. Or I can't support my opinion. I don't know why I think that. And finally, I never thought of it that way. Thank you. Now I will. So our happiness and the happiness of those around us depends on our degree of right view. And the more insight we have, the more understanding we gain, and the more peace we feel, and the more love can fill us. So the other component of the Eightfold Path I want to speak on today is right thinking. It's also been called right intention. And it's very tied to right view. When we train ourselves in right thinking, right view will improve as well. So what is it to think right? We can look at our thinking as the speech of our mind. The speech of our mind. When we think, our mind is speaking, though we're not necessarily speaking out loud. So right thinking means making the speech of our mind clear and beneficial. Making the speech of our mind beneficial. If we watch how we think, we know when our thoughts are beneficial, don't we? We know when they're just negative, right? We know when they're harsh and they're sometimes self-judging and self-defeating. Excuse me. One of the other limbs of the Eightfold Path is right action. And what we think often leads to how we act, right? So our right thinking is needed to take us down the path of right action. And as I said, this practice of right thinking is also called right intention. It's really great if you can start examining before you act, what is my intention here? Is my intention, I always ask in my retreats, I always tell everybody, is it going to bring more unity or is it going to create separation? It's like a gate that it has to pass. If it's going to create separation, maybe don't act, maybe don't speak it, maybe don't write it, right? Everything we do can become more skillful. So to have right intention in Buddhism is threefold. It's the intention of renunciation, which is letting go of your attachments. It's the intention of goodwill, which is obvious. And it's the intention of harmlessness. The opposite of that would be wrong intention, would be intention governed by desire and ill will and harmfulness. Okay? The intention of renunciation, it basically means not letting our desires bind us. You know, it means letting go of our desires and not coming from that place. You know, it's like when I stopped resisting that noisy boat, right? I could return to peace. The intention of goodwill is just checking before we speak, before we act or write an email or whatever we're doing, and see if we're motivated by goodwill, you know. It's interesting to watch your thoughts, and it's surprising, especially if you're reading the news or watching the news, it's surprising how your goodwill can slip away, you know, so it can be motivated by resentment or by ego. And then that third part is intention of harmlessness. And that's before we speak and act, checking to make sure our actions or our words are not harmful. There's a beautiful Buddhist scripture from the Diamond Sutra that says, practicing charity and compassion without attachment. Practicing charity and compassion without attachment is the way to reach the highest perfect wisdom, to become a living Buddha, a living Christ. So we develop the ability to see our intention, and we learn to watch our mind and see if our thoughts are wholesome or if they're unwholesome. And if they're not wholesome, we replace them with wholesome thoughts. Last thing, the Buddha taught that we can replace an unwholesome thought with a wholesome one by changing the peg. It's kind of like a carpenter that replaces a rotten peg by hammering in a new one. Say I start thinking about something negative, like how divided our country is, and I start feeling angry at those who intentionally stoke division, and it makes me feel anxious, right, and tense in my body. I can see that happen and decide I'm going to change that peg from that rotten thought, from that negative thought, to the thought, to a different thought, you know, to putting in a new peg. And the new peg, the new thought might be, I'm a force. I'm a force for change. And so in my actions, which are the only thing I have control over, I'm going to create unity. I'm going to call out division in my own little circle. I'm going to offer more and more ways we can create unity. And I am going to keep envisioning this country turning around. I'm going to keep envisioning how I want it to be, how we're going to unite, how we're going to create more unity. And Lord, it's going to take patience. But I'm going to hold on to that vision. I'm going to hold that vision. And that is a way that I'm doing my part. Okay? That thought, it feels empowered, doesn't it? It's energy giving, it's positive, it's wholesome. So this simple changing of mind, of thinking, takes me from wrong thinking to right thinking. In Buddhism, they talk about having a mind of love. We often think of having a heart of love, but bodhicitta is having a mind of love. And that's basically, that means we have a wish to cultivate understanding in ourselves. We have a wish to do that, and in order to bring happiness to many beings, okay? So that they can be free of suffering, so we can be free of suffering, so we can all become enlightened. The last deepest teaching, really, of right thinking is about moving towards less thinking and having spaciousness between thoughts. When you meditate, notice the space between thoughts. Notice the space between a collection of thoughts. And let there be more space. So in closing, I hope I've been able to inspire you to make efforts to develop more skill in the ability to look at your view, look at your point of view, your perceptions, and to work to see more clearly beyond the filters and the conditioning, and see how you might review your views and evolve them. And I hope you'll also watch the content of your thinking. And if it's unwholesome, learn to, in the moment, change to more wholesome thinking. You know, we always have the choice. We can always change our mind. And finally, become aware before you act of what your intention is. Watch yourself. Watch your intention. Make your intention free of manipulation. Make it full of goodwill, full of harmlessness, full of goodness. So may we all see with a view that is the eyes of God, full of love and compassion, and may our thoughts be full of goodwill and pure intention. Thank you all. God bless you. Hey, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you. I hope that wasn't too long.
No, not at all.
No.